Good day, class. Today I'm going to be showing you how to articulate using an articulating table, which is also known as an occlusal table. So before you articulate, I'm just going to go through the elements that make up an articulator. It's the same elements that we would have discussed in your theory lecture, but now I'm just going to go over them one by one for you to also ensure that your articulator actually is in good condition. So the first thing that we are going to identify is the upper member of the articulator. So this is the upper member, and then you have the lower member, and you have the incisal pin. And if you look very closely on the incisal pin, you're going to see that there is a hole, and in that hole the incisal guide pin goes into that hole. You have the incisal table, which is the white part of the articulator, and then here you have your condylar elements, right? And the condylar elements have screws. Before you articulate, you need to ensure that the screws are actually tightly locked, right? And if your screws are tightly locked, you won't be able to move the articulator in any direction. So if you were to hold your incisal pin and try and move the articulator from left to right, you're going to see that there is a restriction of movement. If we open up the condylar nuts, right, if we loosen them up and if we try and move the articulator from left to right, you're going to see that there is going to be some movement. So before you articulate, ensure that the screws are tightly locked and that the articulator cannot move at all. Okay, so in addition to what we have just gone through, you also will have what is known as mounting plates. These enable the cast to be attached to the articulator, and they come with screws. Right, so I'm going to show you now how you attach the mounting plates onto the articulator. So you're going to see that the mounting plates have projections on them, and these projections go into the grooves that you find on the members of the articulator. So ensure that when you place the mounting plates, that the projections go into the grooves. You will tightly screw these. You will also do the same on the lower member, ensuring that the grooves actually go into the projections. Okay, and lastly, this is your articulating table, which is also known as an occlusal table, and we're also going to use this when we are articulating. And those are the elements that make up the articulator. So we went over the elements that make up an articulator. Now we are ready to articulate. So what are we going to need to articulate? So obviously we're going to need the articulator and the occlusal table. You're going to need a plaster ball, a spatula. You're also going to need a plaster knife or a wax knife, and you're going to need your models, right? And we are going to be articulating edentulous models. I have a representation of what would be a bite rim, and the reason why I've used this material is because it is durable, and what I have found in the past is that when I used wax, by the time the fifth person would articulate, the wax would have distorted. So this is just a representation of what a bite rim looks like, and you will see when you actually handle this that it actually looks similar in terms of dimension and in terms of shape. Before we articulate, the one thing that you need to ensure is that the incisal pin is actually sitting correctly on the upper member. How do we check? So you see very closely, the incisal pin has threads. I'm just going to unscrew the incisal pin so that you can see all the threads fully. Where are we? Yeah. Okay. So you're going to see that the there is about 8 threads, if I'm not mistaken, on the incisal pin, and there is a deeper thread. What you want is you want this groove here, the one that has a deeper depth, to actually sit at the top of the upper member. So I'm going to show you now. Okay, so there we go. So it should look exactly like that, and then you would screw or lock your incisal pin. All times before you articulate, ensure that the incisal pin is sitting correctly onto the upper member. The next thing that I'm going to do now is unscrew the lower mounting plate, because we are going to use the occlusal table for mounting the maxillary bite rim. By using the occlusal table, it means that we do not have to use the elastic method as per Barnwell's theory. We also do not need to use the incisal guide pin to locate the center of the rims. So the articulating table actually works as the Barnwell's triangle. What I have done in preparation for the articulation on the models is I have ground some grooves onto the models. This is going to help with mechanical retention. Show that you have grooves, and what you can do in addition to these grooves is actually scrape the undersurface of the model with your plaster knife. So this will also give added mechanical retention. Okay, you don't need a lot of grooves, right? So that should be fine. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the lab putty, which represents the maxillary bite rim, and place it onto my model. So it should look like so. And what you want to do is you are going to place it on the occlusal table, but what you need to ensure is that the midline is actually in line with this notch, and the facial surface of the lap putty is sitting right at the start of the notch. I'm going to show you now what I mean by that. So the facial aspect, I'm going to show you now. The facial aspect of my lap putty is sitting right at the start of the notch, and as you can see, the midline of my bite rim is also in line with the notch. Also need to check is if when I place the incisal pin on the incisal table, that the midline is also in line with the pin. Because the pin obviously has a bit of thickness, you have to either close your left or right eye. And if you choose to, for example, if you choose to close your right eye, you need to ensure that at all times when you're checking the midline that you are closing your right eye. So what I will do when I'll be checking, when I'll be marking, I'm going to check to see if the midline of the bite rim actually coincides with the pin. I will close either my left or right eye, and it should be that at least one of the two cases is actually true in terms of the midline actually coinciding with the pin. Also, they need to ensure is that the lap putty is actually stable on the occlusal table. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is mix some plaster, and what I will do is just load the plaster onto the top of the model, and then I'm going to close the upper member onto the plaster, and what will happen is that there will be a seal between the mounting plate, the plaster, and the model. I'll be doing that. I will keep on checking to see if my midline is still coinciding with the pin, and also going to keep on checking to see if the facial aspect of my lap putty is in line with the start of the notch. Use ratios for articulating, but you just have to be mindful that you don't waste. You want your mix not to be too runny, but you also don't want your mix to be too stiff. If it happens that when you would have placed the incisal pin on the table and you see that you have inadequate space between the model and the mounting plate, what you then need to do is just grind down the height of the model so that you have space for your plaster. Right, so I'm just gonna double check my midline to see that it's actually in line with the notch as well as the model. All right, so everything looks fine. So what I'm gonna do now is just load my plaster. Okay, if there's a bit of movement when you're doing this, it's just a matter of just double checking your midline before you close the upper member onto the plaster. Okay, so I'm just gonna check. Okay, and then you push down the upper member until the pin sits on the incisal table. And what you want to do at this point is just clean the plaster. Right, as you would have seen on the other video that I showed you in class, you can use water as well to clean the plaster, and you don't do this on your table as I am doing it. The only reason why I'm doing it on the table is because it's a demonstration. You are going to do it in the plaster room. Okay, so I'm just going to use a bit of water. You need to let the plaster sit with the bite rim or the lap putty for at least 10 minutes before you articulate your mandibular model. Okay, so I'm just smoothing out the plaster. Right. For the finish of the plaster, what you're going to have to do is obviously water paper or sand it down. Okay, so I'm just going to give it about 10 minutes for it to set, and I'm going to do the articulation of the lower cast. So I've waited for about 10 minutes for the plaster to actually set. So as you can see, my pin is still sitting on the incisal table. It's very important that your incisal pin actually sits on the incisal table. If you find that after you would have articulated that there is a gap between the incisal table and the incisal pin, you need to start again. All right, otherwise when I'll be marking, you will get 0 for your articulation. The one thing that I forgot to mention is that with articulation, it's either it's correct or it's wrong, right? Because remember, what is articulation? You're actually taking what's in the patient's mouth and you are then transferring it onto the articulator. So it cannot be that you're going to take something from the patient's mouth and then articulate something that is totally different. So you need to ensure that you are very precise when you are articulating, and that you do not make any errors, and if you find that you have made any errors, that you restart right away. With articulation, it's either you get 100% or you get a 0. Okay. With that said, and one thing that I also forgot to mention that you need to be mindful of when you are mounting your maxillary bite or lap putty is the fact that the lap putty is a flexible material, so flexibility needs to be somehow controlled when you are placing the incisal pin onto the incisal table. So what do I mean by this? So when you will be placing your upper member onto the plaster, try and not exert too much pressure or excessive pressure onto the model, because then what will happen is you actually pushing down onto the lap putty, and what will then happen when the plaster would have set, the lap putty will then spring back to its normal dimension, then causing a gap between your incisal pin and your table. So when you place your upper member onto the plaster when it's still wet, ensure that you do it gently and you do not exert excessive force. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount the mandibular lap putty or the mandibular bite rim. Now what you would have noticed is that on the maxillary lap putty there are indentations. These grooves actually go onto the mandibular projections. So what you need to ensure is that when you place your the portion that represents the mandibular bite rim, that the grooves actually go into the projections. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the occlusal table, and I am going to place the mounting plate. Remember, the projections of the mounting plate need to go onto the grooves of the lower member. Alright, I'm going to screw that, ensure that it is tightly screwed. Okay, and now what I'm going to do, you need to look very carefully, is I'm going to place the upper member onto the table surface like so, and I'm going to take my lower or mandibular lap putty, place it onto the groove. When I place these onto the grooves, automatically the midlines will align. I'm going to load plaster onto the surface, and I'm going to gently lift up the lower member to meet with the incisal pin. Right, I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to lift the lower member slowly to meet the incisal pin. Okay, so now I'm just going to prepare my plaster. Okay, try and create a bit of height. Rather you have too much plaster than too little. Okay, so now I'm going to gently lift my lower member, right, and push it down and ensure that it meets the incisal pin. Again, don't exert too much pressure. If you exert too much pressure, remember the lap putty is flexible and it will spring back. It's also important that when the bite rims are together, that your pin is sitting flat on the incisal table. Okay, so I'm just going to neaten up my plaster work. Okay, and I'm going to give that about 10 minutes. for it to set. And as you can see, I have articulated my models. Okay, so after the 10 minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to neaten up my plaster work. So you see in areas like this where the plaster is projecting beyond the model, I'm actually going to trim away the plaster using a model trimmer. But you need to be very careful when you're trimming around the model, because what may happen is that you may also have the mounting plate projecting beyond the surface of the model. So you need to ensure that you don't trim away that metal. So in that area, I'm just gonna use my water paper to make it smooth. After I would have done that, I would then clean my articulator. Okay, so I've given my plaster enough time for it to initially set. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the lap putty. This is what you should have. So when in order for me to trim away the excess plaster on the side, I'm going to have to remove my models from the articulator. Okay, and this is what I have. And so I'm going to try and trim away that plaster, but remembering to be very careful not to trim away the mounting plate. I'm also going to trim away that plaster there, because as you can see, the mounting plate is not in line with the model. So I'm also going to do the same on the lower. I'm going to remove the model. So here's my articulation neatened up. So now what I need to do is transfer the markings that would be on the pipe. Right, the reason why we do this is because in industry you would normally use your pipe block to actually set up the teeth, and once you would have set up the teeth, then obviously all the markings would be lost. So to preserve the markings, you will then need to transfer them onto your model. So I'm going to remount my frames, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer this line to the model. Okay, I'm going to use a ruler to do this. So you can use a normal colored pencil if you want. Okay, and then I'm also going to use an instrument to engrave this marking. The reason why I'm engraving it is because as you will be working, the colored pencil marking may rub off. So, if this was an actual bite block, you will also have canine markings, which will also then transfer onto your model, and this will need to align with the artificial canines that you would set up. Now the marking that we need to mark is the vertical dimension. So how do you mark the vertical dimension? You literally just pick two points randomly along the midline. Then you're going to use a spring divider to measure the two random points, and then you're going to take those points, you're going to transfer them here at the back of your model, and you're actually going to write down the measurement of the vertical dimension. Okay, so I have my spring dividers. So along the midline, I'm just gonna pick two random points, and I'm gonna scrape those points. Okay. And then I'm gonna take my ruler and find out what is the measurement of those 2 points. So it works out to be 4.6 centimeters. So I'm going to take my spring dividers as they are. I'm not going to adjust them. Take them to the back of my model, and I'm going to mark the vertical dimension. All right, so basically I'm just scraping my model, and then I'm going to highlight the area of my vertical dimension, and then I'm going to note there that the measurement is 4.6 centimeters. And then here at the front, I'm going to elongate the points that I made for the vertical dimension. So I'm going to make a straight line. I'm going to do the same thing here at the bottom. And after I would have done that, then I'm going to highlight this area using a colored pencil. As you can see, I have my midline transferred to my model. I have my vertical dimension, which I'm going to try and maintain. And I also have a second reference point for my vertical dimension. That is it, and that is your articulation complete. So when you will be handing in your articulation to me, hand it in with your table, because when I'll be marking, I need to check that the incisal pin actually sits on the incisal table with the maxillary bite rim on the occlusal table. I also need to see that with the bite rims together, does the pin sit on the incisal table? And if that is all correct, then you will get 100% for your articulation. Other marks will also come from the neatness of your work.